as you've probably seen, I decided to break up this last discussion from Dr. Anderson's book. It was just getting a little long with the last two chapters. So I hope you enjoyed this last chapter discussion. As we end our discussion on Anderson, chapter 7, he gives us an overview of Black higher education from 1900 to 1935. So from 1870, this is just a little bit of historical information before we get to 1900. From 1870 to 1890, there were 9 federal Black land grant institutions in the South. And that increased to 16 by 1915. Yet, at this time in 1950, only one institution in the South, one of these 16 institutions, had collegiate level educations. So the others, as you probably gather from the chapter, were high school and normal schools. They had high school and normal school classes. And again, normal schools are teacher training institutions. So earlier when teacher training started, it wasn't a collegiate 4-year degree. So that's why Anderson is making that distinction that in 1915, only one of the Black land grant institutions had collegiate classes. And that one school is Florida A&M or FAMU. So during this time, there were also still many private schools that owned colleges and universities. And as Anderson gives the example, from 1926 to 1927, there are 13,860 Black college students, yet 75% of them were in private Black colleges. And again, as Anderson points out, this is an ongoing interrelationship that's happening between philanthropists and the Black community, and specifically Black missionaries who are also involved in the higher education, the private schools. Each of the philanthropy groups took their view of what Anderson called the Negro's place to shape their relationship with education policy and its vision, higher ed's vision, as they saw it in the New South. And philanthropy in this case was a lot of the Northern missionary societies. Unlike other philanthropists, the Northern mission societies had the mission to, and this is a quote from the top of page 241, they wanted to prepare a college-bred Black leadership to uplift the Black masses from the legacy of slavery and the restraints of the postbellum caste system. So these philanthropists saw higher education as most important, specifically classical and what we now call liberal arts education. And so this form of higher education, it wasn't radical to the Northern philanthropists and to these Northern missionary societies, but it definitely was radical for Southern philanthropists and Southern society. And they go on to point out and make it known that because of enslavement, Black individuals had to be taught. Again, there's this kind of white idea of what Black individuals need to be taught. They need to be taught values, and this is a quote, values and rules of modern society, which the Northern philanthropists saw as liberation. And that liberation was going to come through classical education. And they also saw providing these schools as the white Northern missionaries and philanthropists, saw their involvement in the higher ed for Black individuals as their atonement, as Anderson discusses. And on page 243, Anderson discusses the types of classes that they had, including moral science, which I still want to look that up because I'm interested to know what they're meaning by moral science. And as you can see, they added political science in the senior year. I'm also curious to know what political science for them at that time looked like. And again, this is a shift from what Anderson starts to call industrial philanthropy. And of course, at this time, advocates for industrial education had a lot to say against this type of education that the Northern Missionary Society wanted to see. And specifically on page 247, we see William Baldwin, who is a trustee of Tuskegee, And he's also the first chair of the General Education Board. And keep in mind, that was a Southern philanthropic agency. Because again, Southern philanthropists and Northern philanthropists that were promoting industrial education believed that Black higher education should funnel Black youth into areas that permeated the racial caste system and help channel funds to meet this goal. Again, they weren't interested in liberation for the Black community through higher education. They wanted it to continue to perpetuate the racial hierarchy that was happening in the. And I think this is indicative in how Anderson talks about the endowments for Black schools at this time. So in 1926, $20.3 million was the total endowment for 99 Black colleges. Yet, of that $20.3 million, $14 million of that belonged to Hampton and Tuskegee. Again, Hampton and Tuskegee were the model industrial education schools in the South. And again, keeping in mind, as Anderson reminds us, that a lot of the students in these Black colleges at this time were elementary and secondary education, which he points out in 1915, 79% of the students in Black colleges are elementary and secondary education. And he talks about that on page 249. And just as the Black colleges are starting to get their rhythm, there soon is a additional goalpost added, which Anderson talks about is the introduction of national and regional accrediting agencies, including standardizing organizations like the College Entrance Examination Board, whose mission prior to 1913 was actually just to make sure all higher education was standardized, that everything was looking the same and everything was equal in the opportunities that they had. But after 1913, the College Entrance Examination Board start listing colleges that have been accredited, which we see that starts putting more pressure on Black colleges to meet these standards. And it wasn't until 1928 when the Southern Association of College and Secondary Schools, as Anderson says, took Black colleges seriously and rated them separately. So up until this time, there was the accreditation, and they were listing who was accredited, but at the same time, they weren't looking at Black colleges seriously, as Anderson is discussing, and actually accrediting them. And it was the Southern Association that started to do that. And we see that W.E.B. Du Bois had attempted to do this by listing out, making his rankings of colleges in 1900 and 1910. And as we move into the top of the 20th century, we also see that a lot of Black colleges were also seeking the help from industrial philanthropy, because they knew that that's where most of the money was coming from for Black education. And Anderson describes this as them throwing themselves at the mercy of the General Education Board. And again, the General Education Board was run by a variety of philanthropists that wanted to model all higher ed Black institutions after the Tuskegee model. And it was developed by Southern philanthropists. So while the Northern missionary societies and other Northern philanthropists who wanted this positive outcome for Black education or Black higher education, they were asking for money from industrial education philanthropists, they were still unwilling to let go of the mission of classical education training, of what we see Anderson calling the Black talented 10th. And it's not just Anderson, this is historically how they were describing how they wanted to support, and that was their mission of Black education, Black higher education. Anderson is talking about how these two missions for higher education came to a head in the Du Bois articles, or Du Bois article, and then also the Williams report. And again, Williams is affiliated with the General Education Board. And both agreed on less Black colleges and concentration and reduction, but the differences are Du Bois wanted the concentration and reduction to increase opportunities for Black college students. Whereas the Williams Report, again funded by the General Education Board, wanted to reduce the scope of Black higher education. So again, those two missions are coming into play even with these reports. And again, they agree on concentration and reduction, but for very different reasons. And again, this is a reminder of industrial philanthropists, their continued goal of influencing the direction of Black higher education. But at the same time, we're starting to see that Black students are questioning how they're being prepared and looking at the outcomes for those students who have graduated from Hampton and Tuskegee and other industrial education schools that have been modeled after Tuskegee and Hampton. So as Southern philanthropists and Northern philanthropists that are industrial education, who want the industrial education models, as they're questioning how they've been teaching students and if students are able to be able to work in society because of what they've, the information and the education that they've given them, they're questioning that at this time. So they decide to form the Committee on Negro Education. And this committee realizes that it would take many decades for taxation to catch up to where Black education needed to be. And I made a little note, I wonder why that is. And if we remember, Anderson has talked about double taxation, gerrymandering. And again, yes, it would take decades for it to catch up, but that's because of the actions of white Southerners, taking money to build white schools, not using taxes for building Black schools. So it would take extra time because they weren't doing it from the very beginning. So after this report from the committee, they decided that they wanted to leave and focus their energy on other things. And they decided they were going to focus their energy on Black medical education because they saw that Black physicians, quote, would have a place in the South. So again, this influence that they want to have, and at this point in history, they decided that they were going to set their sights on Black medical education. So at this point in the chapter, and I'm around page 260, Anderson starts to discuss the race relations that are happening in the South. So we know all of these are going on, but at this point in the chapter, Anderson starts to point those out. And he talks about how they're escalating. And also during this time, industrial philanthropists like Peabody, who we see, begin to use admin at Black institutions to start quieting students and community objections to industrial education. So we see this in the example of Fisk University. You have the student-run newspaper, the Fisk Herald, that was shut down, and then it was replaced by a more conservative newspaper, which is called the Fisk University News. And this is in the year 1917. And Anderson starts to discuss how there's this direct action that is happening all across the South. And at this point, the General Education Board decides to launch a $1 million capital campaign for Fisk University alone, again because they're trying to influence higher education, and Fisk is one of their models for higher education, Black higher education. So they're launching this $1 million campaign, and they also start a $5 million campaign that Tuskegee and Hampton will end up sharing of this $5 million campaign. And again, these campaigns are with the goal to continue to promote industrial education model. And at this point in the chapter, Anderson also talks about how they added Booker T. Washington to the Fisk University. And I'm kind of giggling because it's funny because they add him to the Board of Trustees, hoping that he would, quote, bring his sources of revenue to Fisk. So again, they're attempting to influence, and they're using strategic Black leaders that they've placed on these Board of Trustees, which they don't have many, because remember, they don't want to listen to Black trustee members, but they're making an exception for Booker T because they want him to bring his resources. So I just thought that was highly funny. And how it's written, I'm not sure that Booker T actually does that, how Anderson writes that, but I haven't done the research. That will be something that I'm very curious about. So as philanthropists are in this quest to make Fisk one of the model Black higher education institutes, we see that Rosenwald visits Fisk. And Rosenwald, and this is on page 265, where they start to talk about his visit, and then it goes to 266, one of the quotes I'm going to talk about. So he comes to this visit, and he has mixed emotions. And he has mixed emotions because Rosenwald, again, who helped build all the Black rural schools, is conflicted because he supports industrial education, but at the same time he comes to Fisk University, and he thinks that black students are way too liberal, and that they have too much autonomy. And he's just, that is the conflict that he has, is that they have too much autonomy. And Rosenwald is wanting Fisk, and really any industrial education, to be accommodationalist institution, meaning that Black students accommodate to white authority and power. And he doesn't see this at Fisk University. So that's, again, where his mixed emotions come in. And Rosenwald says they seem to be an air of superiority among them. Again, he's talking about his visit to Fisk University. And he goes on to say, and a desire to take on the spirit of the white university, rather than the spirit of which always impressed me at Tuskegee. And again, Rosenwald was conflicted because he expected to see students not having a voice, not having autonomy, and expected it to be the same as Hampton and Tuskegee, which is what he was on board to support. So Fisk was, and Anderson goes on to talk about how Fisk University was seen as, or they wanted it to be seen as, what he called a Negro accommodationalist university, where Southerners, white Southerners specifically, of course, and Northern industrialists had taken control from the Black educators and white missionaries. And they had done this because they hoped it would rid the school and the students of its spirit of equality and begin to train more conservative Black leaders, what they deemed the right way or the right type of Black leaders. So again, this is what Fisk's mission was as they were developing it. But I think what is interesting here is that Fisk is also the institution where W.E.B. Du Bois got his degree from, where he graduated from. And so we have these Black leaders, and I was about to call him radical, but he's not radical. He's just asking for what the Black community deserves, and what they've been denied. So we have Northern philanthropists who want Fisk to be this, but we have students like W.E.B. Du Bois who are graduating from Fisk University. So we also see that Fisk also they've already silenced the newspaper, the student-run newspaper, but then we also begin to see more student protests that are happening on campus. And we see that President, at this time, Fayette McKenzie, the work that he puts into place to continue to silence students and to silence the community around Fisk, and to also silence alumni. So, but at this time, while the president is trying to do these things, he also is under attack. And there's a couple of examples that Anderson talks about. There's the truth-telling attacks by Du Bois, who is a Fisk alumni again. And Du Bois sets a direct challenge to the administration in 1924. And there's also a New York Times article that is posted in 1925. And at this time, we also have student strikes that are going on at Fisk University. And as the student strikes are going on, you have a protest that goes on where 2,500 of the Black Nashville citizens come out and declare that Mackenzie's, quote, usefulness as president of Fisk is at an end. And this quote is on page 269. So we see how students and alumni and the community come together, but we also see how other white men boosted Mackenzie and denounced the voices of the Black community. And we see Thomas Jesse Jones, who is a board of trustee member at Fisk University, comes to the defense of Mackenzie at this time. And he essentially says that the uprising and this talking against what is happening at Fisk University is dangerous not only to the well-being of Fisk University, but also to sound race relations throughout America. So he was essentially saying that Black individuals having a voice, Fisk alumni, Fisk students, Nashville residents, Black Nashville residents, all of them having a voice was going to deter race relations. Because again, they wanted to hold Black individuals in an inferior position in society. And what was happening at Fisk University was going to disrupt that and turn it on its head. So as a response to what was happening at Fisk University, the General Education Board they withheld their endowment pledges. Because again, remember, they had a $1 million campaign going on for Fisk and a $5 million campaign going on for Tuskegee and Hampton. So withholding this money from Fisk University, it also discouraged others from talking against the industrial model or industrial education philanthropists, which they counted on doing, withholding their funds. They counted on it silencing individuals. They eventually gave the $1 million to Fisk, which there was a change in Fisk leadership. So Mackenzie was no longer the president, and someone who had even stronger convictions of industrial education was made president. So then they gave the $1 million to Fisk, and they doubled down on the $5 million campaign for Tuskegee and Hampton. Because again, those are the models for industrial education. So they doubled down on getting those campaign funds, that $5 million for Tuskegee and Hampton, because they really wanted to continue to push that mission of industrial education. Yet, at this time, by 1927, Hampton students had other ideas. They wanted more rigorous curriculum and educated teachers, which we see some stories in Anderson as he's talking about students' grievances. Students also wanted to get rid of racist teachers, and Anderson tells the story of how 5 of the Hampton teachers had participated in a KKK rally, and others had developed a club that was openly discriminatory and worked to discourage hiring of Black teachers. Hampton students were demanding more than industrial education philanthropy had offered them in the last 40 years. And they wanted what they called the Du Bois ambition. So on page 274, Anderson points out that what is happening at Hampton University reflects Black youth's assertiveness and commitment to the quality of higher education shown in the increase of enrollment across the South and in the District of Columbia, which is where Howard is. That's why he always includes that in his charts. And speaking of his charts, we go back to the chart on page 246 that shares college and professional student numbers in 1900, which was sitting at 3,880 total students across the country, across the South and DC, and a little over 3,000 of those students were men. Versus, we see the chart on page 275, which is 1935. We see that that number has increased from 3,800 to 29,269. And at this point, 12,700 were men. So we're also seeing this increase in Black women who are attending colleges and professional schools. Anderson concludes the chapter by discussing that Black higher education had mixed reviews from both Black and white communities. And as you can imagine, that was determined by who was running the schools, also where the schools were located, what was their mission. And Anderson concludes the chapter by discussing the impact that higher ed has had in cultivating Black leaders, including those who would launch the civil rights movements across campuses and communities in the South during the 1960s. Anderson reminds us that education and self-improvement and self-determination was always important to the Black community. It was never a cultural value that Black education, or that education was not important to the Black community, which is sometimes rhetoric that we hear. It's always been important. And again, as we go think about the beginning of the book, Black education was for the liberation and to extend emancipation. And ultimately, asking for education was also extending that liberation to all kids, not only Black kids. And again, that's what the Black community does over and over. Anything that they're wanting for themselves, they understand that that is going to help liberate others as well. And I just wanted to really say that I appreciate Anderson so much. As a historian, he is a role model for what history and historiography can look like, the depths that it can look like. And Anderson has also helped me in my own research as I look at the Black community, Black education in my own community in North Carolina. So I've used Anderson, particularly rereading Anderson. This is the third time I've read or reread Anderson, and specifically intentionally using him in a current article that I'm working on has really been impactful for me. I hope you have enjoyed learning more about Anderson and reading about Black education in the South during this time. And I hope you will continue to have that topic as something that you're interested in. And I will work, if it's not on this video, it'll be in a later video, but I'll also include additional books and resources so you can continue on your journey about learning about Black education. I hope you all have enjoyed this 3-part discussion, and I'll talk to you soon.